My name is Lena Mercer, and for 6 years I did not speak to my parents. Then I made the mistake of bringing my husband home. It was supposed to be my younger sister's engagement weekend. A simple thing. A dinner, a toast, one carefully staged family photo so my mother could frame it and pretend we were the kind of people who had never broken each other. Instead, before the soup had even gone cold, my father asked my husband what he did for a living, and when Jonah answered, my father laughed in his face in front of everyone. Not a polite laugh. Not an awkward one. The kind of laugh that means I have already measured you and found you small. My husband did not argue that night. He did not defend himself. He did not list a single thing he had done, or a single person whose life he had helped hold together. He just sat there quiet, one hand around his water glass, and let my father enjoy the sound of his own voice. But I knew that quiet, and I want you to remember it, because less than 24 hours later, in a room full of the exact people my father spent his life trying to impress, that same quiet man stood up, and my whole family learned who he really was. Welcome back. If you've ever watched someone kind get mistaken for weak, you already know this story isn't really about money. It's about the moment a person who has spent a lifetime being underestimated finally gets seen in the only way that matters. And if a story has ever made you sit all the way still because it felt a little too familiar, then stay with me. Because this one ended in a way my father never recovered from. Let me tell you about my husband first. Jonah Reed is 38 years old, and he wears the same brown watch every day because it was his father's and because, according to him, if a thing still works, then it has not earned replacement. He is not loud. He is not flashy. He does not chase rooms. He listens for a living. Officially, Jonah runs the legal aid clinic in Broward County, which means, in plain English, that he spends his days helping people who are already one bad month away from losing everything. Eviction notices, custody filings, veterans benefits, medical debt, predatory contracts, grandmothers raising grandchildren on fixed incomes, men who worked 30 years and got told the paperwork was wrong, women leaving bad marriages with a diaper bag and a bruised mouth and no money for a lawyer. That is what my husband does. He does it for less money than my father thinks a man should make. He does it with a desk that should have been replaced 10 years ago and a coffee maker that sputters like it's giving its last testimony. And still, his phone rings after hours. Not because he wants attention, not because he invites it, because people remember the one person who picked up when they were scared. I've seen him kneel on our kitchen floor at 11:30 at night with legal papers spread around him like fallen leaves, explaining to a crying father over speakerphone why he still had options. I have watched him leave half-eaten dinners to print forms for a woman hiding in her sister's basement. I have watched him sit in silence with people so ashamed of needing help they could barely look at him and somehow make them feel human again before the conversation was over. He never comes home talking about wins. He talks about names. Marisol got to keep the apartment. Mr. Hanley finally got the pension letter corrected. Tasha's boys are sleeping in their own beds tonight. That is the language he speaks. It is also a language my father has never understood. My father's name is Calvin Mercer, and if you asked him who he is, he would tell you in square footage. He grew up with less than he wanted and spent the rest of his life treating money like a religion and embarrassment like a mortal wound. He owns Mercer Development now. Office parks, townhouse lots, retail strips with tasteful stone signs out front. He wears expensive boots that still somehow look angry. In my father's world, worth is measurable only if it can be framed, billed, or taxed. My mother, Diane, has spent 40 years translating that worldview into social manners. She smooths his rudeness into honesty. She calls cruelty high standards. She can insult you with a smile, so gentle you almost thank her for it. My younger sister, Ava, was the reason I went back, not my parents. Ava called me in tears 3 weeks before the engagement party and said, "Please don't make me do this weekend alone." She was 29, smart enough to know exactly what our family was, and soft enough to still hope it could occasionally behave. She wasn't asking me to forgive anyone. She was asking me to stand beside her while she crossed one of the big life thresholds our mother had been staging in her head since Ava was 12. I loved my sister, and our grandmother, June Mercer, had also asked. Grandma June is 81 and shaped like a question mark and has more truth in her than everyone else in our family put together. She called me 2 days after Ava did and said, "Honey, I am too old to play peacemaker, so I won't insult you by trying. But I would like both my granddaughters in the same room before I die, and I would very much like to meet the man who had the good sense to marry you." That made me laugh despite myself. Then she said something stranger. "Your father is about to learn that there are kinds of power he never bothered to recognize." I asked her what that meant. She only said, "Come home and wear comfortable shoes." That was June. Half prophecy, half practical advice. I should tell you why there had been 6 years of silence in the first place. It wasn't one fight. Families like mine are rarely broken by one moment. They are eroded by 1,000 small permissions. A cutting joke at dinner. A career mocked as cute. A boyfriend assessed like a stock option. A daughter spoken about, never to. But 6 years ago, there was a night that turned. Erosion into a cliff. I was 28. Jonah and I had been together less than a year. He was still working long hours at the clinic and picking up extra shifts teaching community workshops, so he could keep up with his loans. My parents invited me to what they called a small dinner. It was not small, and it was not just family. They had invited one of my father's business associates and his son, a polished man in a blue suit who worked for a private equity firm in Charlotte. By the second course, I realized the whole evening had been arranged like a silent auction, and I was the item on display. My father made a toast about shared futures. He put his hand on my shoulder, like I was a property line. Then he said, in front of everyone, "Some women waste their 20s on boys with noble hearts and empty pockets. Thank God my daughters were raised to know the difference." I felt the whole table hear it. I stood up and said, as calmly as I could, "I'm seeing someone. His name is Jonah. I love him, and I'm not available for whatever this is." My father looked at me the way men like him look at disobedience when it happens publicly. "Love," he said, laughing. "He works legal aid, Lena. He makes a career out of other people's failure." My mother said nothing. Ava cried into her napkin, and I left. I did not slam the door. I did not scream. I just left and stopped trying to build a daughter-shaped bridge across a gap my parents had no intention of crossing. 6 years. No holidays. No Sunday calls. No accidental drop-ins. The only person I kept seeing was Grandma June. When I told Jonah we were going back for Ava's engagement weekend, he listened without interrupting and then asked only one question. "Do you want me to go because you want me there?" he said. "Or because you think you're supposed to bring a husband to a thing like this?" That is him, always walking straight past pride to the real part. "I want you there," I said. He nodded. "Then I'm coming." We booked a room at a little inn just outside town. My car, my keys, my exit plan. If it went ugly, we left. I said it out loud. Jonah repeated it back to me the way he does when he wants me to know he heard it all the way through. "If it goes ugly," he said, "we leave." The Mercer house sits on a hill just above Briar Lake, all white columns and expensive stone, and windows too tall for any private person to need. My father likes houses that look like they are already impressed with themselves. The engagement dinner was in the back dining room with the long walnut table and the sideboard full of silver no one is allowed to touch incorrectly. There were maybe 15 people there. My parents. Ava and her fiancé, Trent Hollis, whose family owns 3 car dealerships and a face appropriate to the business. My father's business partner, Douglas Pike. Douglas's son. A couple of my mother's church friends. Grandma June at the far end, wrapped in lavender and watchful as weather. Jonah shook hands, remembered names, complimented the flowers, asked Ava about her ring in a way that made her unclench for the first time all evening. For 20 minutes, I let myself think maybe we would make it through. Then my father leaned back in his chair, tapped the side of his glass, and smiled across the table at my husband. "So, Jonah," he said, "Lena's always had a soft spot for strays. What exactly is it you do?" The room got that waiting hush expensive rooms get when the host is about to decide someone's status. Jonah set down his fork. "I'm an attorney," he said. I run the legal aid clinic over in Broward County. My father blinked once. Then he laughed. A free lawyer? He looked around the table for his audience and found it. So people come to you when they can't pay their bills, can't keep their marriages together, can't stay out of trouble, and the state gives you a little paycheck to sort it out? No one answered. He leaned forward, amused with himself. That's not law, son. That's paperwork with pity attached. My mother lowered her eyes, like she had not heard him exactly. Douglas Pike smirked into his wine. Trent looked deeply interested in his mashed potatoes. I felt heat climb my neck so fast it made my ears ring. And Jonah just nodded once. Some days, he said quietly, that's one way to describe it. That was all. My father waited for a defense, and when one didn't come, he grew larger in the silence, like men like that always do. Well, he said, I suppose somebody has to clean up after everybody else's bad decisions. Under the table, Jonah's hand rested lightly against my knee.
Not stopping me.
Steadying me. I knew that touch. I shut my mouth because I suddenly understood that if I spoke, I would be doing it for my own humiliation, not his. Dinner limped on. My mother asked Ava about floral arrangements in the tight, cheerful tone women use when they are trying to cover the smell of smoke with perfume. Douglas began talking about commercial zoning. My father got up after dessert and gave Trent a little tour of the study, showing him framed permits and plaques and photos with mayors. At one point, I passed the doorway and heard my father saying, "Real work leaves something you can point to." Jonah, of course, only said, "I'm sure your projects took a lot of persistence." He was being gracious to the man insulting him in his own house. That, more than anything, nearly broke me. We left as soon as it was polite. In the car, halfway down the hill, I said, "I'm sorry." Jonah looked out the passenger window for a second before answering. "For which part?" "For bringing you into that," I said. "For thinking 6 years changed anything. For letting him say that to you in front of everyone." Jonah leaned his head back against the seat. "Lena," he said, "I spend half my week with people who have been talked down to by systems bigger than your father. I promise you, I am not wounded because an insecure man mistook status for substance." I laughed despite myself, but I was still furious. "You could have told him," I said. "Anything. You could have made him look stupid in one sentence." Jonah turned to me then. In the passing light from a gas station, his face looked calm in that particular way that means his mind is fully made up. "Your father doesn't believe speeches," he said. "Men like him believe rooms." I remember gripping the will tighter at that. "What does that mean?" He smiled faintly. "Nothing you need to worry about tonight." The next morning we went to breakfast at Mabel's Diner on Oak Street because it was the only place in town where the coffee was honest. We had just sat down when the waitress came over, stopped short, and put a hand to her chest. "Mr. Reed?" Jonah looked up, surprised. Then his face changed into recognition. "Patty," he said. "How's your grandson doing?" That was apparently the right question because the woman's eyes filled instantly. "He got the tutoring placement," she said. "And the housing appeal went through. We're still in the apartment because of you." Jonah smiled like that was entirely ordinary. "I'm glad," he said. She squeezed his shoulder before she walked off. 10 minutes later, a man at the counter lifted 2 fingers in greeting. "Morning, counselor." A young woman bussing a table paused to say, "My sister still talks about what you did for us." When we stepped outside, the barber from 2 doors down called across the street, "Jonah, tell Ms. Alvarez I got the forms." And Jonah knew every single name. Not vaguely, not socially. The way you know people when you have stood beside them on bad days. I looked at him differently after that. Not because I didn't already know who he was. I did. But because I had not understood how wide the circle was. In my father's town, my husband was not small. He was known. By noon, my mother called. That alone told me it was serious, because my mother prefers communication to happen through softer people. "Your father thinks last night got off on the wrong foot," she said. That was her version of an apology. Not one person did a wrong thing. The evening simply got off. "He'd like everyone at the Founders Gala tonight," she continued. "It will be more formal. Better company. A fresh start." The Founders Gala was a yearly town event at the Briar Hotel Ballroom. Donors, council members, business owners, school board people, church people, everyone my mother thinks counts, and everyone my father wants photographed near. I almost said no. Then my mother added, Douglas and the Hollises will be there. Ava would like her sister present. And frankly, Lena, if Jonah wants to be taken seriously, this is a better room for him than a family dinner table. I actually closed my eyes. There it was. The invitation and the insult folded neatly together like pressed linen. Before I could answer, Grandma June's voice came faintly over the line. Put me on speaker, Diane. My mother made a little offended noise, but she did it. June said, Child, go tonight. Wear the blue dress. And tell that husband of yours to bring his patience. Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone. Jonah was sitting in the in chair, nodding his tie. You heard that? I asked. Every word, he said. I narrowed my eyes. Do you know something I don't? He smiled without smiling. Probably several things. That was all I got. So we went. The Briar Hotel Ballroom had been dressed within an inch of its life. Cream tablecloths. Gold candles. Too many orchids. A stage at one end with a podium and a projection screen cycling through photos of town projects and sponsor logos. My father was already there, standing near the front in a tuxedo that fit like self-approval. My mother glittered beside him. Ava looked beautiful and nervous. Trent looked expensive and hollow. When we walked in, my father gave Jonah's suit one glance and said, At least you own a decent jacket. I felt Jonah beside me go still for half a breath. Then he said, Good evening to you too, Calvin. That was the first time I had ever heard him use my father's first name. Something in me sat up. We were seated at a table near the front with Douglas Pike, Trent's parents, a county commissioner, and the juvenile court judge, Elena Vargas. My father clearly intended this as another lesson in what he considered real importance. He did not know Judge Vargas already knew my husband. The first time she looked at Jonah, her whole face warmed. Reed, she said. I was hoping you'd make it. My father glanced between them. You know each other? Judge Vargas smiled. I've known your son-in-law by reputation for years. By work, too. My father made a neutral sound that meant he disliked information he had not arranged. Dinner was served. The mayor spoke. Sponsors were thanked. My father's company logo came up on the screen twice, and he sat a little straighter both times. Then came the awards portion. There were always two community honors at the Founders Gala. One for business investment, one for civic service. The business award went first. Unsurprisingly, it went to a bank president who had financed the new sports complex. My father clapped hard enough for both of them. Then the MC returned to the stage. And now, she said, the Briar Lantern Award, given each year to a person whose work has protected this town not through visibility, but through service. I saw Judge Vargas glance sideways at Jonah. He looked mildly alarmed. Interesting. The MC continued. This year's recipient has spent more than a decade doing work most people never see until the day they desperately need it. He has kept families in their homes, helped grandparents keep grandchildren, secured disability benefits that should never have been denied, helped veterans untangle paperwork that nearly cost them everything, represented abuse survivors who had nowhere else to go. And he has done it all with very little interest in praise, publicity, or plaques. There was a murmur through the room. My father looked vaguely bored. Then the screen behind the podium changed. Not to a logo, to photographs. A woman standing in front of an apartment building holding a key and crying. An older man in a VFW cap shaking someone's hand. A young mother with 3 children on courthouse steps. A foster family at an adoption hearing. And there, in the corner of each frame, half out of them as if he had not intended to be in the picture at all, was Jonah. The room shifted. My father's smile vanished. The MC said, Please join me in honoring this year's Briar Lantern recipient, Attorney Jonah Reed. I have never heard a room turn that fast. Every head at our table snapped toward him. Across the ballroom, people began standing before he had even moved. Not everyone, but enough. A mechanic near the back. A school principal. 2 nurses. An elderly couple. The owner of the feed store. A woman I recognized from the diner. Then more. Hands rising into applause, people already on their feet. The sound spread outward like weather rolling in. I looked at my father. He was frozen. Not angry yet. Not even defensive. Just confused in the way powerful people get confused when a script they did not write begins unfolding in front of them. Jonah looked like he wanted the floor to open. He leaned toward me and muttered, "I forgot this was tonight." I stared at him. "You forgot." He winced. I was hoping they'd let me skip the speech if I hid in the back. Judge Vargas laughed softly. Not a chance. The ballroom was still applauding. Slowly, with the expression of a man walking toward a dentist, Jonah stood. And that was when I noticed something else. People were not applauding politely. They were looking at him with recognition, relief, love. He made his way to the stage as if he would rather be anywhere else. When he reached the podium, the applause took a long time to die. The MC handed him the glass lantern award. He looked at it like it might bite. Then he leaned toward the microphone. "Well," he said, and the whole room laughed because it was so clearly not how he wanted to begin. "This is my nightmare," which means somebody up there has a sense of humor. The laughter warmed the room, but my father did not join it. Jonah glanced down once, gathered himself, and spoke. "I don't really believe one person gets credit for work like this," he said. "Not honestly. Every win attached to my name belongs to a client who kept going when things would have been easier to give up on, or to a clerk who stayed late, or a judge who paid attention, or a social worker who made the extra call, or a neighbor who testified, or a grandmother who took in 2 kids when she was already tired." A few people smiled at that. He kept going. "So, if you've ever been part of one of those stories, this belongs to you much more than it belongs to me." Then his eyes moved across the room and landed, briefly, on my father. Not in challenge. Not in revenge. Just fact. "I know legal aid can look small from the outside," he said. "It's mostly paper. Mostly waiting rooms. Mostly conversations nobody wants to be having. But if you stay in it long enough, you realize the paperwork is never the point. The point is time. Time for a family to stay together. Time for someone to heal. Time for a person to keep a roof long enough to find their footing again. Most of us only get to change lives in very quiet ways. I think those ways count too. There are lines that sound like speeches. And then there are lines that land because they were lived before they were spoken. That line landed. The room went very still. Jonah thanked his staff. He thanked Judge Vargas. He thanked his secretary named Millie, who had apparently bullied him into attending. Then, to my complete surprise, he thanked Grandma June. "For teaching me," he said, "that dignity sounds the same in every income bracket." Grandma June, who had been sitting at a table near the aisle, put a hand over her mouth and nodded once. Then Jonah did something I will love him for as long as I live. He ended quickly. No dramatic flourish. No grand reveal. No revenge. He simply said, "Thank you. Please never make me do this again," and stepped away from the microphone. The room laughed and applauded again, louder than before. When he came back to the table, people were already turning in their chairs to reach for him. The commissioner shook his hand. Trent's mother said, "I had no idea." Douglas Pike, who had looked at him like furniture the night before, suddenly could not smile hard enough. My father sat very straight and very still. He waited until the applause died and the next segment started before leaning toward Jonah and saying, in a low voice sharpened to a blade, "Quite a show." It was meant as an accusation. Jonah unfolded his napkin and laid it beside his plate. "Yes," he said evenly. "It was kind of them." My father stared at him. That should have been enough. It wasn't, because the room did not move on the way my father expected it to. Once people remembered Jonah was there, they kept coming. A veteran with a cane stopped by to say, "My wife wanted me to tell you we got the back pay." A woman in a green dress squeezed his hand and whispered, "My daughter starts college in August because you wouldn't let me sign that foreclosure surrender." The owner of the hardware store said, "If you ever need a roof fixed, it's done." And every time, Jonah nodded like he had received a weather update, not gratitude big enough to reorder a room. My father's jaw worked harder with each interaction. Then Judge Vargas stood again and returned to the podium. "One more note before dessert," she said. Several people asked whether tonight's recipient would finally let us mention one more thing he's been doing without credit. Jonah actually muttered, "Oh no." The judge smiled. "Too late, counselor." She looked out over the ballroom. 3 years ago, when the textile plant closed, this county saw the highest eviction filing spike in a decade. Several local attorneys donated hours. Churches donated groceries. Landlords in some cases showed grace. But one person, quietly and without publicizing it, created the Briar Bridge Fund to cover emergency filing fees, bond costs, utility reinstatements, and temporary legal expenses for families in crisis. There was another murmur. I turned to Jonah, so fast my neck clicked. He did not look at me. Judge Vargas continued. He seeded that fund himself. Others later joined him, but it started with him. My father's face changed. Not red this time. Gray. Because unlike an award, money was a language he understood instantly. And because of that fund, the judge said, 42 families stayed housed long enough to recover instead of collapsing into homelessness. The screen behind her changed again. Not pictures this time. Numbers. 42 families housed. 17 custody cases stabilized. 9 veterans' claims reopened. Utility shutoffs prevented. Emergency guardianships filed. Then one final line, started by Jonah Reed, continued by a town that learned from him. No total dollar figure. That was the part one loved most. They had translated generosity into outcomes, not price. The room applauded again, but softer now. More reverent than excited. My father pushed back from the table. Not enough to stand. Just enough for his chair to scrape. He leaned toward me, voice shaking with contained fury. "You knew about this?" I answered honestly. "Not all of it." He looked at Jonah as if redoing a math problem and hating the result. "A clinic lawyer," he said quietly. "A little county do-gooder. And all this time you've been playing benefactor?" Jonah finally turned fully toward him. There was nothing hot in his face. Nothing triumphant. "If by benefactor you mean I used what I had where it was needed," he said, "then yes." My father gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "And everyone in here is supposed to fall down over that? You throw a few checks around, save a few people who would have sunk anyway, and now you're a saint." The woman on my other side stopped eating. Across from us, Douglas Pike looked like he wished deeply to evaporate. Judge Vargas, still near the stage, heard enough to go still. Jonah's answer came soft. It was never about being a saint. That should have ended it. Instead, my father did what frightened people with money often do when money stops working. He got meaner. "You know what I think," he said. "I think men who can't build real things hide in charity because applause is cheaper than success." I heard Ava inhale sharply. Trent looked at his plate. My mother whispered, "Calvin." He ignored her. And something in me, something that had been bending toward patience all weekend, went finally and completely still. Before I could speak, though, Grandma June did. She did not raise her voice. She did not even stand. She simply turned in her chair, looked straight at her son, and said, "If you are going to humiliate yourself in public, Calvin, don't make us all wait for it." Several people at nearby tables heard her and pretended very badly not to. My father flushed. "Mother." "No," she said. "I have let your volume borrow authority for 40 years, and it was a poor investment." The silence that followed was surgical. Then she did something I still think about. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick cream envelope. She set it on the table between my father and Jonah. "I did not intend to make this anyone's business," she said. "But since you appear determined to discuss what counts as real work, let's count properly." My father stared at the envelope. "What is that?" June looked almost bored. "The documentation showing that when the tax error on my old house nearly cost me my deed last spring, your office told me it would be simpler to sell the property and move into a condo you had already selected." My father opened his mouth. She lifted one hand. He closed it. Mr. Reed spent 4 months correcting the filing, waived every fee, and paid the recording costs himself when he learned I would otherwise choose groceries first. I felt the air leave my lungs. I had not known that. Neither, clearly, had my father. June tapped the envelope with one finger. If you open that, you will see exactly how much your son-in-law charged your mother for saving the house your father built with his own hands. My father did not reach for it. June went on, her voice low and mercilessly calm. You spend your life mistaking visible things for valuable things. Plaques, facades, logos, rooms full of people afraid not to clap. Meanwhile, the man you laughed at last night has spent years holding up the lives you drive past on your way to your clubs. If you still cannot tell the difference, then that is a poverty no bank will ever fix. Nobody moved. I looked at Jonah. He looked almost pained, not because she was wrong, but because she was saying aloud the things he would never have said for himself. My father looked around the ballroom, at the stage, at the award in Jonah's hand, at the people nearby who had definitely heard enough, at the envelope, at me. And for the first time in my life, I watched my father realize he was not the most respected man in the room. Not even close. He turned on me, because of course he did. This is what you wanted, he said. You drag your husband in here, turn a family weekend into theater, and let me be blindsided by some civic worship service. I stood up. Not fast. Not dramatically. Just enough to meet him eye level across the white linen and silverware and the wreckage of his certainty. I didn't put him on that stage, I said. My voice came out so steady it startled me. You didn't get blindsided by me. You got contradicted by reality. His face hardened. You always did enjoy a scene. There was a time that line would have made me second-guess my own pulse. Not anymore. No, I said. You enjoy scenes. You build them and call them leadership. What I enjoy is the truth when it finally stops asking your permission. My mother made a small sound, like a crystal glass being set down too carefully. I kept going because 6 years of silence will either empty a person or sharpen her. It had sharpened me. You asked what kind of work my husband does, I said. Now you know. He keeps people in their homes. He keeps children with safe adults. He keeps old women from losing the houses their husbands built. He gives his time to people who can't repay him because he thinks their dignity matters anyway. That is what he does. My father tried to cut in. I did not let him. And the next time you are tempted to laugh at him in public, I said, remember this room. That landed. Because for the first time all evening, my father looked out and understood the room was not his. Not really. Not tonight. He stood abruptly. His chair tipped and Douglas Pike caught it on instinct. We're leaving, my father said to my mother. It was not a request. My mother rose because she has been rising when he says rise for most of her adult life. But before she could step away, she looked at Jonah. Really looked at him. There was something old and tired and almost ashamed in her face. And she said very softly, I didn't know about June's house. Jonah nodded once. I figured. It was not accusation, which somehow made it worse. My mother swallowed and followed my father out. Ava stood frozen halfway between tables, torn so visibly it hurt to watch. Then she crossed to me, hugged me hard, and whispered, I'm sorry. For what? For all of it, she said. I held her face in both hands. You do not owe me for what they are, I told her. She nodded, crying, and went after her mother because someone had to. The ballroom slowly breathed again. People returned to their tables. Dessert resumed. Silverware clinked. Conversations restarted in soft, stunned pockets. The event carried on because public humiliation, unlike private pain, is often forced to coexist with coffee service. Judge Vargas came over, squeezed Jonah's shoulder, and said, For the record, you handled that better than most elected officials I know. Jonah sighed. Low bar. She laughed and moved on. Grandma June reached for my hand. Well, she said, that was better than television. I started laughing so hard I nearly cried. Jonah sat back down beside me and loosened his tie like a man who had just survived weather. I leaned toward him. You forgot this was tonight? I said. He rubbed his forehead. I remembered the gala. I forgot Millie put my name in for the award months ago and that the committee is apparently full of traitors. 42 families? I whispered. He looked embarrassed. It was a hard year. I stared at him. A tax deed for Grandma? She asked me not to make a fuss. Jonah. He looked at me then, finally, and in the middle of that ballroom, under chandeliers my mother would have sold a cousin to own, he smiled in that small, helpless way that made me fall in love with him. It needed doing, he said. That was his whole philosophy in 5 words. It needed doing. We stayed another half hour because leaving immediately would have made the whole thing feel more dramatic than it needed to be. People came by quietly. Not to congratulate him, exactly. More to thank him again in little bursts. A pastor said the bridge fund kept one of his parishioners from sleeping in her car. A principal said a custody order Jonah filed let one of her students stop transferring schools every 2 months. The mechanic from the back table said, "You remember when you told me asking for help wasn't the same as failing?" I still think about that. Every story rewrote the room a little further away from my father. And Jonah accepted every one of them with the same expression, grateful, uncomfortable, and entirely uninterested in turning any of it into a performance. On the drive back to the inn, I expected to feel adrenaline, triumph, something sharp. What I felt instead was relief. Not because my father had finally been beaten in some dramatic moral contest, but because I no longer needed him to be the one who told me I had chosen well. A whole town had already answered that question long before I got there. I asked Jonah, somewhere past the lake road, "Why didn't you ever tell me about the fund?" He watched the dark trees move past the window before he answered. "Because once generosity starts keeping score," he said, "it changes species." I was quiet a moment. And Grandma's house? She was embarrassed. "So you protected her pride." He shrugged. "People deserve that too." I reached over the console and took his hand. At the inn parking lot, before we got out, he said, "I'm sorry about your parents." I looked at him. "No," I said. "Tonight cured something." And it had. The weeks after that did not bring a miracle. My father did not call to apologize. He did not wake up transformed into a gentle man who had learned humility in a chandeliered ballroom. That is not how men like him change. If they change at all, it is in tiny humiliations suffered privately, where no one applauds the process. But certain things did shift. Ava started visiting us, without asking permission from the family gravity she had grown up under. My mother called once, left a voicemail, and said only, "Your grandmother's hydrangeas are blooming. She'd like you to come Sunday if you can." It was not about the gala, not directly. But in our family, invitations without conditions are their own kind of language. Grandma June later told me my father had asked, in a voice she described as mad at the furniture, whether the people at the gala really thought that much of Jonah. She told him yes. Then, according to her, he sat down and did not speak for a very long time. That was not repentance, but it was recognition. And sometimes recognition is the first punishment pride ever receives. As for Jonah, he went back to work Monday morning. Same brown watch. Same dented coffee maker. Same two-fold desk. Somewhere in Broward County, someone was crying over a notice with too many legal words on it, and my husband was already reaching for a pen. The Briar Bridge Fund continued quietly. More people contributed once the secret was out, though Jonah tried unsuccessfully to keep his name off every thank you letter. Grandma June kept her house. Ava got married in the fall. Small ceremony. Neutral venue. My parents behaved because now they knew what a room could do when it stopped agreeing with them. And me? I stopped waiting. That is the true ending, I think. Not the award. Not my father's face. Not the ballroom turning toward the man he mocked. The true ending was the moment I understood respect is not a prize your parents hand you when you finally become legible to them. It is something you practice inside your own life. It is the peace of standing beside the person you chose and knowing, with a certainty nobody else gets to vote on, that you chose with your whole heart and chose well. For years, I thought the tragedy was that my father could not see value unless it arrived wrapped in money and applause. But that was not the tragedy. The tragedy was how many people had probably stood in front of him over the years, decent and extraordinary in ways he had no training to recognize, and he had mistaken them for ordinary because they were not loud. Jonah never needed my father's approval. That was my lesson to learn, not his. He already knew who he was. The town knew too. The only person who had to find out in public was the man who laughed first. That's my story. 6 years of silence. One cruel dinner table. One ballroom full of the exact people my father thought belonged to him. And a quiet man whose life was bigger than anyone in my family had bothered to imagine. If there is somebody in your world being judged by the size of their paycheck instead of the size of their character, let this be the reminder. Some of the most important work in a town is done so quietly that arrogant people mistake it for smallness. And if you have ever loved someone gentle in a world that rewards noise, be proud of them out loud. I finally am.